Argano NRL, and I am here to talk about data management basics in 50 minutes, quote unquote, or less. Now, I'm really hoping this is going to be 50 minutes or less. I've recorded it a couple times so that I thought I could get it under 50 minutes. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn up my video, just because I've had some little minor internet connection issues with Zoom. So not that I'm not lovely, but I'm going to kind of shut off the video. So let me continue on. So first of all, I am coming to you from sunny Tucson, Arizona. This photo was taken about 10 minutes away from my house. It's sunny 300 days a year here. Tucson is home of the saguaro, which is that funny cactus with the arms. And if you ever come here on vacation and you take a ride on the Sabino Canyon tram, they will tell you that saguaros live to be 200 to 250 years old, but they don't grow arms until they are at least 70 years old. So that saguaro is probably about 200 years old. So that was just to make you jealous. So a little bit about Argano. Our mission, or our primary mission, is to leave the world a smarter place than we found it, which is part of the reason for some of these webinars, because we like to share information. We have a really good set of books called Look Smarter Than You Are, then you might want to take a look at. We are a 5-time EPM and Analytics Partner of the Year. And our net promoter score is 77%, which is pretty darn good compared to the industry average of 24%. So, and that's actually why I came to Argano NRL. So we have a few upcoming webcasts. Today, we're going to talk about data management. There's a couple of webinars tomorrow. There's a couple of webinars next week, all of which are going to be fascinating. Mine is very specific to data management. Some of the others are kind of geared towards specific application markets, such as retail and healthcare. So the normal disclaimers apply. I'm not going to read them aloud. The best one is the last one. Oracle EPM Cloud changes potentially every month, and the details in the training guides may evolve, but that also means that there's always new things in the product. And there is a little tiny new thing in data management that I'll address really briefly towards the end of the presentation. Now, I am going to ask, because I've got a lot of slides, I am going to ask that you save your questions for the very end so that we can get through all the slides. And if I'm not able to answer your questions during the webinar, we will have an email address that you can send questions to so that someone can respond. So the first question is, why would you even use data management? I mean, there's other ways to get data into your EPM application, so why would you choose data management? So data management is an ETL tool, which stands for Extract, Transform, and Load. And in this slide, I am showing you a target application data form in an FCC target application. And you notice it has a fascinating title, Data Management Webinar Data Validation Data Form. But I put a little red box around a cell in that data form, which represents an intersection of $9,500 for the actual scenario for year FY19 for a period March, for entity B499, for account A4001, which is our product sales account, for department 210, geography GO1, excuse me, and the Sentinel tablet product, which is actually product P underbar 100, although I didn't display the product identifier. But that $9,500 balance is actually made up of 5 separate balances in my ERP system, because in my ERP system, I actually track balances for 5 different Sentinel tablet product models, P111 through P105. So when viewing a balance in an EPM application as an end user, there's a little indicator in the upper right-hand corner that means that drill through is available. So if I or you or whoever's looking at the data form, and this would work in SmartView as well, if you click on that cell, you right click on that cell, you have an option to drill through to source. And there is a setting in data management that determines if you have that. And if you right click and you choose drill through to source, then you can go to the screen called Amount Details, which is actually part of data management. And at the top part of the screen, it actually shows you the intersection and all the dimension members of the cell that you clicked on. So scenario, year, period, view, entity, intercompany, account, department, geo, product, the currency dimension, the consolidation dimension, the movement dimension. And so that is all of the dimension members of the intersection that you clicked on. In the bottom part of the screen, it shows you all of the records from your ERP system that made up that $9,500 balance. And for each one of those records, which actually in our case came from a file, there is a little gear option where you can choose to drill through to source, open the source document, or view the mappings. Now, the drill through to source option, we're not going to cover that in this webinar. That assumes that you have a source system with an adapter. And that means that you might be using like Fusion ERP Cloud, where there's actually an adapter that reaches into your source system and pulls data directly out of the appropriate tables. So for example, I come from the eBusiness Suite background. There was a data table called GeoBalances, and that's what the adapter connects to if your source system was on-prem eBusiness Suite. There's an equivalent table for cloud ERP. But if the source system was just a file, right, you still have the option to open the source document and view the mappings. So if I click on the open source document option, I can view a copy of the original data file. And I'll explain in a minute why it's a copy and not the actual original data file. But if you look at the data file has records, and every record has account, department, geography, product, a description of the product, and then an amount. And so on the first row, the amount is 0, and the next row it's 1,000, and the next row it's 2,000, and so on. And you notice 1,000 plus 2,000 plus 3,000 plus 3,500 adds up to 9,500. So the first 5 rows of the data file for products P101 through P105 made up the $9,500 balance that I showed you in the cell for product P100 in the target application. There are 2 more rows in the data file that have 0 balances, and those are for products P111 and P112, and those are also actually mapped to a single product in the FCC target application called P_110. Now, the View Mappings option, which is available to you from the target application, which in our case is FCC, allows you to view the mappings that resulted in the value, which was exported to that target application that you clicked on. And the most meaningful one to you right now that I've explained so far is the very last one. It says we mapped products P101 through P105 in the source data file to P100 in the target application. Now, I'll touch on really briefly a couple of the other ones of this. The only one I'm going to talk about right now is data source. So data source is a dimension in FCC. It wasn't there in HFM, but everybody created a custom application for it. So in FCC, it's just part of the application. And data source doesn't exist in the data file. So what we have is we have a mapping that says every record that we load from the data file, we're going to map that to an intersection that references the FCCS managed data member of the data source dimension in the target application. Now, data source out of the box for FCC has a couple of different members. The one that you use for loading data from data management is called managed data. There is another member called data input. You use that member when you are literally typing data into a data form and submitting it. There's another member called journal input, and that gets used when you enter a journal and post the journal. So it gives you the benefit of being able to make certain that when you're looking at a balance, you know where it came from. It came from data management, or it came from entering data via data input, or it came from posting a journal via journal input. So because it's not in the file, we had a mapping that provided a default value. So data management basics. Basically, my goal in this webinar is to get data from that data file, which has multiple records, each one of which has account, department, geo, product, a product description, and then an amount, into those FCC target application intersections. Now in FCC, you have some standard dimensions: scenario, year, period, view, entity, intercompany, and account, and then data source, currency, consolidation, and movement. Those are all standard data sources, or all standard dimension members in FCC. Department, geo, and product in our FCC target application are custom dimensions that we created as part of the implementation so that we could have additional detail for income statement accounts like product sales. So the file has data for the account, department, geo, product dimensions, and the amount value. So we have to figure out in data management, how are we going to provide the values for the other dimension members for the target intersection? Where are those going to come from? Well, some are going to come from the point of view, which is going to give us the scenario, the year, and the period. Some are going to come from a location, which will provide default values for the currency dimension and the consolidation dimension. And some are going to come from data load mappings, which is the intercompany dimension and the data source dimension and the movement dimension that aren't anywhere in the file, but we need to provide a default value for the target intersections. So data management configuration involves all of these steps. I'm just going to talk about them very briefly here because I'm going to cover them in detail in their own slides. First of all, we're going to review some system settings. Then we're going to review the source system setup, which in our case is just a file, and that's always seeded as a source system in data management. We're going to review the target application setup, which could be financial consolidation and close, or planning or account reconciliation cloud. The target application is basically what are the dimensions in your target application so that you have something to map to. Then we're going to talk about category mappings. Category mappings provide a default value for the scenario dimension in your target application. Period mappings provide values for the period and year dimensions in the target application. An import format specifies that in that file, account is in field number 1, department is in field number 2, geo is in field number 3, product is in field number 4, and amount is in field number 6. The location provides default values for the currency and consolidation dimensions, but your location also references the import format so that if you have a location called Dallas-Fort Worth, that you know that Dallas-Fort Worth always gives you a file where account is in field number 1 and department is in field number 2. So the location will reference the import format. And then for the dimensions that aren't in the data file anywhere, you can create data load mappings. And that's for the intercompany dimension, the data source dimension, the movement dimension. But then if you have multiple records in the data file, like we do for product, data load mappings will also allow you to map those multiple values from your ERP system to a single intersection in the target application. Then we're going to create a data load rule. And the data load rule definition is going to reference a point of view, which is what is the period and year for which I am loading data? What's the member of the scenario dimension for which I'm loading data? What's the location that references the import format that specifies where the data is in the file? And also, what is the name of the data? What is the name of the data file and where is the data file? Like what subdirectory is it stored in? Then we're going to execute the data load rule, and it actually does 3 things. First one is it imports data into data management's staging table, which is where the validation step takes place. So the import step uses the import format to pull data into the staging table. The validate step, even though it's called validate, it's really the mapping step. It applies your data load mappings so that if there's no data there, for example, for the intercompany dimension, that the mapping step or the validate step will actually provide the default value for the target intersection for the intercompany dimension and the data source dimension and the movement dimension. And then the export step pulls that data out of the data management staging table and populates that intersection in the target application where you can right click in the cell and drill through to the source. Now we can optionally review imported data in data load workbench, and we're going to do that because that is where you would see whether or not running of your rule had failed. And there's a couple reasons why things would fail. Usually things fail because you've added a new dimension member and you haven't created a mapping for it. So maybe you've added a new cash account in your ERP system because you now have a bank account in a new bank, but you haven't mapped that ERP system cash account to the single cash account that you have in FCC, your consolidation system. And we're going to export data to the target application. That can actually happen as part of running the data load rule. I have a little note that that works differently for ARC because in ARC, you actually have to go into the ARC application and run the rule via the data exchange interface. And we do that in the 3-day ARC course. And lastly, we can review the exported data in the target application, which is what I showed you in the very beginning, which is why you would use data management to begin with. So let's talk about the data management setup. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here. So first of all, data management is accessed by clicking the little hamburger icon in the upper left-hand corner of the EPM Cloud homepage. And you don't have to call it the hamburger, that's what we call it, or we call it the pancakes. But it's the navigator icon. It's those 3 little horizontal lines, right? And then data management will be available in the integration menu. Now the data management interface, and this is the legacy interface, which will eventually go away. It has 2 separate tabs. One is called Setup, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's Setup. And then the other one is called Workflow. So depending upon your security role for data management, you may see both tabs, or you may only see the Workflow tab. So if all you ever do is execute data load rules, you might just see the Workflow tab. Now I should mention here, one of the really nifty things with FCC in the cloud is that you can run data load management rules from Task Manager as an automated task. And that has some spiffy aspects because then you actually never have to go into the interface. And you can also set it up so that if your data load rule fails, that you get an email. So that's pretty cool. So you may or may not actually ever see this interface if all you do is run data load rules, because you could run them from Task Manager. So the first setup thing that you would do as an admin is to review some system settings. And there's a lot of them, but I'm only going to talk about 3. The first one is archive mode. If we set that to copy, what that does is it creates a copy of the original data file so that when you right click in a cell and you drill back to the amount detail screen, that you have the option to open the source document. And when you open the source document, it's literally looking at a copy of the original data file that gets created because you set this setting to copy. The second system setting is called the log level. There are 5 levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Log level 1 is not much information for troubleshooting. Log level 5 is way too much information for troubleshooting in general. So the just right log level is probably 3 or 4. And that's how we have this set. The Enable Map Audit, this was available in on-premise FDM EE as of 11.124. And what that option allows you to do is it allows you to run a report that documents every change you made to your mappings. So let's say that previously you mapped 4 products in your ERP system to 1 product in FCC, and now you only map 3. Well, you want to see the details of that, excuse me, that changed the mapping. So I used to map 4 products to 1, now I map 3 products to 1, and that lets you run a report that gives you that detail of exactly what changes you made. Step number 2 is to review your source system. By default, data management is part of FCC. File is always registered as a source system. It's not anything you need to create. The other records that you see in the screen are mostly source systems that use an adapter to actually reach back to the database tables in your source system, such as eBusiness Suite or Cloud ERP, or possibly even something like SAP, and actually pull data directly out of the database tables into the data management staging table without going through a file in between. Now, I will tell you, I have taught at clients where they, even though they have a source system that has an adapter, they tend to use a file because they actually don't necessarily want people in their EPM application to drill all the way back to their ERP system, because that would require another user license, but it is an option. Right, step number 3 is to register and review the settings of your target application. So in this screen, we have a target application. It's a financial consolidation target application called FCC Train. Once you choose that target application, it automatically pulls in all of the dimension members that are defined for that target application. Excuse me. And although you can't see them all at the bottom of the screen because it's scrollable, all of the dimension members in my target application are there. So scenario, year, period, view, entity, intercompany, account, department, geo, product, data source, currency, consolidation, and movement. I'm so proud of myself. I remembered all of those. Those are all actually there in the dimension details at the bottom of the screen, and they are mapped to columns in the data management staging table. Right now, you notice some custom dimensions like department, they actually map to a data table column name called UD3 or UD4. Excuse me, because we don't know what your custom dimensions are going to be. Now, the other part of registering your target application is looking at your target application options. And I'm only going to talk about 2 here in the interest of time. The first option is create drill region. You're going to set that option to yes. That is what enables the drill through to source option in your target application. Enable zero loading is an option that you can turn on. You can force loading of zeros later. You have to enable it because for applications like FCC, you don't always want to enable the loading of zeros. Zeros take up space in the cube. They take up time when you run consolidation because you're forcing consolidation to look at every record even though there's no balance. So you have the option to load zeros. It is enabled here. You can force loading of zeros in another screen, but that may or may not be something that you want to do. Also, in your application options, you can specify default members for target application dimensions that are not in the file, but we can also do that in the data load mapping. So this little chart, which you could see really well if you squinted, shows where each target dimension member will be derived from. So scenario, year, period, view, entity, intercompany account, etc. I'm going to go through each one of these. And also, we're going to talk about the data management point of view, which is choices that you make when you define and execute a data load rule. So when you execute a data load rule, you pick a location. The location is associated with an import format that identifies which fields in the file contain which values. You pick a period, and notice periods in data management, you don't have a period dimension and a year dimension. You have a period, which is period and year. You have a category in the point of view, and category in data management is basically equivalent to the scenario dimension in FCC or planning. And for ARC, category is actually equivalent to a currency bucket. So when you load data using a data load rule in data management, you're loading data for a specific location, which references an import format. You're loading data for a specific period and year, and you're loading data to a specific member of the scenario dimension as identified by the category that you chose. So first of all, there is a mapping screen that maps the data management category that you see in the point of view to the appropriate member of the scenario dimension in the target application. So row number 4 here, I've said, if I pick the actual category in the data management point of view, that corresponds to the actual member of the scenario dimension in the target application. Now you may wonder why there's 2 tabs, global and application. Global could be used for multiple target applications. The application mapping is specific to a specific target application, such as FCC or a planning application or an ARC application. So I just took care of scenario because that is part of the POV. That's the category. Now, period mappings is where you map a data management period like Jan-19, which is period and year, to a combination of a member of the period dimension and a member of the year dimension in the target application. So again, periods in data management are like a period and a year. You map those to a combination of a member of the period dimension and a member of the year dimension in your target application. And again, you have a global mapping, which could be used by an FCC target application or a planning target application. But if it's specific to an application such as FCC or planning, you can use an application-specific mapping. So now I've taken care of scenario, year, period, and view is also derived from the setup of your period mapping. So next, we're going to talk about the import format. Now, your import format is basically going to specify where is the data in my source file. So in the source file that I've showed you a couple times, we have rows, and every row has a reference for the account dimension, A4001, department, D210, geographical region, G01, product, P101. There is a column for the description of the product. We can see that in the staging table. It never gets exported, but it's useful in Data Load Workbench. And then we have an amount. So we have field number 1 is the account, field number 2 is department, field number 3 is geo, field number 4 is product, field number 5 is the product description, and field number 6 is the amount. But we have to tell data management that that's what the file looks like. So that's what the import format is for. And then we'll attach the import format to a location that will then reference in the point of view. So an import format, when you define it in the setup tab in the import format menu option, you give it a name, you give it a description, you specify the source, and you specify the name of the target application. So where is the data coming from? It's coming from a file. Where am I going to push it to? I'm going to push it to an FCC application called FCC Train. And what type of file is it? Now, our file is a delimited file where everything is separated by commas, and the delimiter character is a comma. It is possible to pull data in from what we call a fixed format file, which is actually like a trial balance report. If you use a file type of, I forget what it's called, but anyway, it's not delimited, fixed format, then you would specify where the data is by referencing character positions. So account might be characters 1 through 15. Amount might be character positions 60 through 70. for example. Okay, but in our example, we're just going to talk about a delimited file. And the delimiter character, you can pick a comma, a pipe character, a semicolon, etc., whatever you want. There's a number of different options. The mapping section of the import format is what specifies where each piece of data is contained in the data file. Now, you only actually need to have an account and an amount. In our example, because we're loading data for sales, as opposed to like a balance sheet account where you don't necessarily care about department and geo and product, we actually have extra fields for department, geo, and product. But you only really need to have account and amount. So if you look at the screenshot at the bottom of the screen, it says account is in field number 1. Department is in field number 2. Geo is in field number 3. Product is in field number 4. There's a description in field number 5. And by the way, you can load 2 descriptions. Most companies would load a description for maybe one of your custom dimensions like department, but usually a description for the account dimension, which I chose not to do. And then the amount is actually in field number 6 of the source file. Now you have some options in the field called expression. For the amount field, you have a number of different expressions that are referenced in the documentation for data management, but NZP is an expression that says, for the amount, if there's a 0, I'm going to load a 0. Now, this would be meaningless had I not enabled loading of zeros back in the target application options. So I enabled it in the target application options, and then I am forcing it to happen here by using this expression on the amount field. Now, if you can picture the data file in your mind, remember the data file had account, department, geo, product description, and amount, but it didn't have entity. Now, it's possible for the data file to have entity, but in my case, it didn't. But the people who gave me the data file told me this is all data for entity B499. So I can specify for every row, I'm going to load B499 as the entity because whoever gave me the file, they told me all the records were for entity B499. And just a comment that in my FCC environment, B499 is actually a valid member of the entity dimension. So I've got my import format that says, where is the data in the source file? Now I'm going to create a location, which will be referenced in the point of view when I define a data load rule and when I execute the data load rule. So my location contains a name, a description. It references the import format, which says where all the data is in the file. It also can specify a default member of the currency dimension and a default member of the consolidation dimension for the target intersection, which we're going to push data to. Now, little tiny bit about currency and consolidation. In FCC, in the cloud, you always load data to the entity currency member of the currency dimension, which means that the balances that you're loading are in the currency of that entity. So my B499 entity, its base currency is US dollars. If I load data to the entity currency member of the currency dimension, I'm loading US dollars. Other members of the currency dimension, like parent currency, get populated via translation, and so you would not load data there. Same thing for the consolidation dimension. In FCC, data is always loaded to the entity input member of the consolidation dimension. All the other members of the consolidation dimension are populated by the consolidation process, and so you wouldn't be loading data there. If you want to make certain that you never try to load data to an invalid intersection, you can actually define invalid intersections in FCC as well, so that if you made a mistake here and you referenced a bad member of the consolidation dimension, your data load rule would fail. But you should load data to the entity input member of the consolidation dimension. which is sort of like the value dimension was in on-prem HFM. There is a report that documents your import format. There's a little bug in the report, which I won't make a big point of, but the documentation does show you that account is in field number 1 and amount is in field number 6. And UD3, I believe, is department, UD4 is geo, and UD6 is product. And entity, actually, we have a default value for it, so it's not actually really in field number 1. But the report has a few little quirks, but it is documentation. So now I've taken care of the scenario, the year, the period, the view, the currency, the consolidation dimensions. And we're going to continue on to dimensions like entity and intercompany and account, etc. So the way that we provide default values for dimension members that aren't in the file, and the way that we map multiple records in the file to a single target intersection is via data load mappings. So the data load mapping, or a data load mapping, maps the imported source value to the appropriate target dimension member. So we've already talked about the dimension members for the scenario, year, and period. Those are all derived from the POV. We've already talked about the members for the currency and consolidation dimensions. Those are derived from the location. So we need data load mappings for dimensions that don't exist anywhere in the file or the import format, such as intercompany, data source, and movement. And we also need data load mappings for things like the product dimension, because we've got 5 values in the source file and we want to map to 1 dimension member in the target. So I'm going to skip over this slide in the interest of time and just show you the individual mappings. So for the entity dimension, we specified a default value of B499. B499 is what we're loading, but it's actually a valid member in the entity dimension. So we're going to have a data load mapping. And notice that you create data load mappings for a specific location, right? Because they may not be the same from one location to another. One location may map 3 products in their ERP system to 1 product in the target. Another location may only map 2 products to 1 product. Right, so it may vary by location. So for the entity dimension, we have a like mapping that says whatever value we load, B499, there is an equivalent member in the target application dimension. So B499 will map to B499 because we used a wildcard. Now, a little comment about this, like mappings and between mappings, they need a little rule name, and you'll see why when we look at the log file. So now I've taken care of the entity dimension. And next dimension, which doesn't exist in the file anywhere and doesn't exist as a default value in the import format, is the intercompany dimension. So we said all the balances that we're going to load, none of them are intercompany, right? A4001 is not an intercompany sales account. So in the target application, everything is going to map to an intersection that references the no intercompany member of the intercompany dimension. So in this example, we have a like mapping that maps any source value, including no source value, to the FCCS no intercompany member of the intercompany dimension. Now, in this case, because we have a target dimension member, right, there's actually a little magnifying glass. You can click on that and actually pick the value. But if you typed it in and you're not certain that you typed it in correctly, there's a little validate button that validates that the member that you reference in the target value column is actually a valid member in the target application dimension. Right, so now we took care of the intercompany dimension. Now, the next one that we're going to talk about is we're actually going to talk about a couple of them. We're going to talk about the account dimension. We're going to talk about the department dimension. We're going to talk about the geo dimension. And in the data file, the values that we reference, A4001 for the account dimension, D210 for the department dimension, G01 for the geo dimension, all of those values have equivalent dimension members in the target application. So for all three of them, I can use a like mapping with wildcards. So source value star, target value star, which means if I load source value A4001 from the file, that maps to a member in the account dimension A4001. So I have a like mapping for the account dimension. That takes care of the account dimension. I have a like mapping for the department dimension. Again, source value star, target value star, because D210 in the file is equivalent to D210 in the target application. And somebody's looking at the rule name and laughing at my spelling, I know. That takes care of account and department. Same thing for geo. In the file, we had geo1. Geo1 is actually a valid member in the target application. So we can have a like mapping for that as well. So now we've taken care of scenario, year, period, view, entity, intercompany, account, department, geo. Now, product was a little bit different, right? Product, we had 7 records in the data file. The first 5 are going to map to a single product in the target application. The last 2 are going to map to another product. So in that case, we can use a between mapping. So the first between mapping says in the source file products P101 to P105. So any value between P101 and P105, including P101 and P105, will map to target dimension P underbar 100. Source values P111 to P112 inclusive will map to target dimension P underbar 110. Now, I didn't put a little red box around the validate button in this screen, but again, in the target value column, I am referencing an actual dimension member. So I should probably click the validate button to make certain that I didn't make a mistake when I typed. All right, so now we've taken care of everything but data source and movement. And those are not in the file, and they're not in the import format. So I've got to specify a default value. And I can specify a default value using a like mapping that says every source value as indicated by the wildcard. And that means even if there is no source value, which there is not in our case, will map to a target intersection that references the managed data member of the data source dimension, which is the member that we always use when loading data via data management. Because remember that there's other members of the data source dimension, like data input, that get used when you're entering data in a data form, or journal input that get used for intersections populated by entering and posting a journal. And all but one. So the last dimension that I need to have a mapping for is the movement dimension. And I can do that with a like mapping. So the movement dimension doesn't exist in the file anywhere. It doesn't exist in the import format. So I'm going to specify that every intersection is going to populate a target intersection where the member of the movement dimension is FCCS movements net income. Again, I picked an actual member of the target dimension, so I could use the validate button. There is a little bit more to the movement dimension that is too much for this presentation, but you should be aware that there is an appropriate member of the movement dimension based on which member of the account dimension you are loading data to. So for product sales, the appropriate member of the movement dimension is FCCS movements net income. And the movement dimension is primarily for cash flow. And I believe there probably is a webinar out there somewhere on the Interwell YouTube channel on cash flow for FCCS. But that's not part of this presentation. So in this presentation, we're just mapping everything to the FCCS movements net income member of the movement dimension in the target application intersection that we're going to populate with our data load rule. So now we have identified a member in some way for every dimension in the target application intersection. And again, there are a couple of reports. There is a mapping report. I've shown you the output for the mapping for the product dimension, so you could see the two between rules. There's also a map monitor report that is an enabled meaning you would be able to run it because of that system setting, called Enable Map Audit. And that gives you a detailed history of detailed audit trail of any changes that you've made to the mapping. And now on to the data load rule. So a data load rule is defined to load data from a specific data file defined in the definition of the data load rule for a specific location, which is tied to a specific import format, which identifies where data is in that file. And you're going to load data using a data load rule for a specific scenario, which was derived from the category mapping, for a specific year and period derived from the period mapping. Right? And notice that data load rules can be scheduled to run automatically, or you can run multiple rules in a specific order by creating a batch that references the rules and specifies the order that they can be run in. And again, I mentioned this before, data load rules can also be run as a task from Task Manager as part of your period close process. And that's actually kind of a very nice alternative, because that way you can get it to send you an email if the rule fails. So executing a data load rule, if you just run it from the data load rule screen, it will initiate the process to import the data into the staging table, apply the data load mappings, and then export data to the target application. So you check the checkbox import from source. That means use the import format associated with location in the POV, populate the source columns in the staging table. Right. The recalculate option gets checked by default. That is only available if the data is already in the staging table and you've changed the data load mappings and you want to reapply the changed data load mappings, which is the validate step. Right. The export mode is what happens. Export mode indicates what's going to happen when you push the data to the target application. Now there's a setting, import mode replace, that indicates what's going to happen to data in the staging table. And then the export mode is what happens to data in the target application. So two separate things. One is what happens to data in the staging table. The next thing is what happens to data in the target application. That kicks off a process. You'll get a process ID. You can go to the process details screen, and the process details screen will show you all the little steps that happen. I imported data from the data file based on where the import format told me that the data was. The transform step applies the mappings to map those 5 products in the source file to 1 product in the target, and to populate dimensions that don't exist in the data file. The export pushes data to the target application. The create drill region step executes because we set that as an option in the target application options. And then for target applications, you do have an option. For FCC, you can say, I want to run the consolidate rule because I loaded data. So why don't I just save myself a click and also consolidate? For planning, you can pick to run business rules if you want to do that. So you can make both those things happen at once when you run the data load rule. Now, if for some reason the data load rule would fail, there is a log file. The log levels are 1, not a lot of detail, 5, too much detail. The log file will show you what location you chose, what period you chose, what category you chose, what rule you're executing, what data file you chose. And I have a little note here. If the data file is not in the right place, the log file will tell you, I couldn't find a file for the particular period in the subdirectory that was referenced in the data load rule. And I know that because I've forgotten to put the file in the wrong in the right location. So I know that the log file will show me that. The log file will also display the data load mapping rules that were executed. And the only one I'm going to point out is that the mapping was executed for the product dimension that mapped 5 rows in the source file to 1 product in the target application intersection. Now, data load workbench, pretty cool, I think. You may not ever need to go here once data management is up and running. You wouldn't necessarily come here unless something failed. But it is nice to look at the screen because it kind of shows you how things happened. So in this screen, we're looking at data load workbench. And if you look at the columns, you'll see a column called source entity and source account and source intercompany and source data source and source department and source geo. Those fields are populated, or those columns are populated based on the import format associated with the location in the POV. And remember that the import format said that your entity was B499, and that's why all the rows say B499 for the source entity. Your import format said source account was in field number 1, so that's why all the rows say A4001, because that was the value in the file. Same thing with department. All the rows in the file had department D210. All the rows in the file had GO1. Now, in source intercompany and source data source, there was nothing in the file, right? So those columns are blank. Now, the entity, account, intercompany, data source, department, geo, those columns are populated by the data load mapping. And I'm going to go quickly to the next slide because this is a little bit more meaningful. You can see source product is the products that were on the rows in the data file, P101, 102, 103, 104, 105. Those were mapped to the data through the data load mapping to P100 in the target application, and you can see that mapping. Now, in data load workbench, just like if you were in the target application, you have the option to open the source document or view the mappings. So if I right click on that amount, there's my source document at the top. Notice the file name is, you probably wouldn't notice unless you've been paying really close attention, but the file name is not the same as the original file. The file name starts with 32 because that was my process ID, and it's actually a copy of the original source file because my archive mode setting was set to copy. So it created a copy of the original file, put it in a place that would be available when I drilled through to source from the target application. The mappings option allows me to see that product mapping, products P101 through P105 mapped to P100. It also lets me see that default values were specified for the data source, intercompany, and movement dimensions from the data load mappings. Now, 2 ways you can get an error. I think I still have 5 minutes. Woohoo! One possible reason that a data load rule could error would be an unmapped source value. So I actually don't have a mapping for product P117. I have a between mapping that says P101 through P105, mapped to P100, P111 through P115, mapped to product P110, but I don't have anything in there for P117. So if that happens, what will happen is in data load workbench, you get a dead validate fish, and you'll get a little tab that says validation errors, and it will give you the name of the source value that you don't have a mapping for. So you can go back and add a mapping for that source value that's in the file, but you didn't have a mapping for it. And there's actually a button in this screen called Fix Maps that will take you right over the map screen. They added that in on-prem version 11.124. So now another way a data load rule could fail is if a source value is mapped to a non-existent target application dimension member. So in my source file, I have A4010. At the bottom of this slide, I have a light mapping that says every source value maps to its equivalent target dimension member. but A4010 doesn't exist in the target application. And so what would happen in that case is the export step would fail, but the log file would tell me fetch of driver member A4010 failed. Now, you know, the wording isn't possibly the best, but it basically means 4010 doesn't exist in the target application, so I can't export to it because it's not there. Right, and then viewing data in the target application, we've seen these screens before. There is the target application data form with $9,500. If you right click and choose drill through to source, it will take you to the amount detail screen. And at the top of the screen, it will show you the intersection you clicked on. In the bottom of the screen, you will have the drill through to source, open source document and view mapping options, which look like what we looked at the very beginning of the webinar. So I'm going to kind of skip through those. Now, really briefly, and I did tell you that, you know, this was going to take more than 50 minutes. I do just want to point out there is now an interface that I think things will eventually move to. This is actually what we use for Account Reconciliation Cloud. So there is a card on the EPM Cloud desktop in the application cluster. The card is called Data Exchange, and it actually lets you see all the same information you would have seen in data management, but the terminology is different. So in the Data Exchange card, I see my data load rule. Okay, and then if I click on I can either run the rule by clicking on the little black triangle, or I have these options like general, map dimensions, map members. So really quickly, the general tab displays the data load rule definition. The map dimensions tab is equivalent to the import format. So you can see my expression NZP for the amount field. You can see my default value B499 for the entity dimension. The map members tab is the same as the data load mapping screen. In the legacy interface, you can see the product mapping there. And then the options tab actually just displays some additional information from the application options, like the fact that you set create drill region to yes, and you enabled zero loading. And then you also said, yes, I want to display validation failure messages. And then the workbench, no fish in the workbench in Data Exchange. I kind of like the fish. You can actually replace the fish with a GIF file of your choosing, if you know where that GIF file is stored. But in the Data Exchange card, they just display as import, validate, and export, but you can still see the mappings for P101 through P105 mapped to P100. And then you still have your data management reports. And one last thing to think about, okay, in my last 30 seconds, at some point, hopefully we'll have a future webinar. This particular webinar was loading data management from a non-EPM source, but data management can also be used for moving data between EPM sources. So last week I was teaching a customer, they're going to populate Account Reconciliation Cloud by pulling data in from FCC, and you can do that in data management too, but that will be another webinar. So I think I'm through. Brianna, are you still there?
I am.
I don't know if we can go over at all. If people want to ask questions, they can, or I believe Brianna will give you an email that you can send questions to, and we will try and get you an answer and email you back.
Thank you, Andrea. If you have any questions, please drop them below using the Q&A box or the chat box. We are at time here, so for those of you who have to depart, we completely understand. I went ahead and dropped the email address below in the chat. That is info@interrel.com. Please feel free to jot that down just in case any questions come to mind later in the day or throughout the week. We are going to stay on for a few more minutes. If you have any questions at all, please drop them below.
And I believe this webinar will go up on YouTube in a couple of days. So if you want to watch it again later when you can kind of stop and back up a little bit and go forward instead of listening to Andrea talk really fast, you will have the option to look at that on YouTube as well.
It looks like we have one question in the Q&A box, Andrea.
Okay. Is it able to connect to NetSuite as a source? You can certainly get data out of NetSuite into a file. I am not entirely certain whether or not there's an adapter. So could you send me that at the info@interrail.com email address, and I will check that out and make certain that I get the correct answer, because I don't want to answer it incorrectly. So any other questions, or is everybody kind of, your head's ready to explode from data management in 50 minutes, which was really 59 minutes? All right, I think if we don't have any other questions, again, remember that this video will be up there available on YouTube. We are also considering possibly doing a one-day hands-on course for data management that hasn't been determined yet, but if we do it, it will probably be something following this example that would be available most likely on Fridays. And other than that, have fun out there in the EPM world, and we're done. Thank you.